Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tochi. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. Loy was 18 when Marco took her away from the only life she knew. She had been a lively girl, full of dreams, with hands that moved swiftly over weaving threads, and a voice that carried laughter like the melody of an evening breeze. Her mother had told her that love was a soft thing, something that settled in the heart like morning dew, gentle and nourishing. But love was not what Marco had given her. He had come into her life like a raging storm, sweeping her away with promises that held no weight. He never married her, never gave her his name, but he placed her in a house that was not a home, and in that house he made her a mother before she had the chance to be anything else. At first she had clung to the idea that he would change, that he would see her swollen belly and find in it the warmth of a family. But Marco was never a man who stayed. He was a shadow that drifted in and out of her life, returning only when it pleased him, leaving behind nothing but his scent and another child growing in her womb. By the time Loy bore her third daughter, she had learned not to expect anything from him. The wooden walls of their small house had memorized the sound of her sighs, the quiet cries she muffled in the fabric of her wrapper at night. She sold fruits in the market, her hands working tirelessly, peeling oranges, bagging groundnuts, arranging bunches of bananas in neat stacks. The mornings were long, the afternoons scorching, and by the time she returned home, her body ached in ways she could not describe. But still, she smiled for her daughters. She wiped their faces with the edge of her wrapper, told them stories about clever tortoises and foolish lions, and filled the spaces Marco left behind with the strength of a mother who had no other choice. When her fourth child, Akira, was born, something shifted in her. There was a coldness in her gaze when Marco appeared at the door after weeks of absence. She no longer asked where he had been, no longer begged him to stay. She simply turned away, tending to her children, as though he were nothing more than another passer-by in the market. Marco, however, did not like being ignored. He never hit her, but his absence was its own form of violence. When he was around, he spoke to her only when he wanted something, food, money, or a place to rest his feet. And when he was gone, he was truly gone, vanishing into the nights, chasing other women, fathering children that he would also abandon. Loy saw them once, the two women who carried his name with pride, their children dressed in finer clothes than hers, their laughter ringing out like the chime of bells. Marco did not hide them, nor did he care if she knew. She was nothing more than a woman he had claimed too early and discarded too soon. But despite it all, Loy did not break. She built her life from the scraps he left behind, molding herself into something stronger, something unshakable. She did not cry when he failed to return for weeks, nor did she flinch when his voice, thick with drink, accused her of being ungrateful. She was not ungrateful. She was simply done waiting for a man who had never truly been hers. The market became Loy's second home, a place where sweat and struggle mixed with the scent of ripe mangoes and freshly peeled oranges. The wooden stall she stood behind every morning was not much, just a narrow table covered with a faded cloth, but it was her lifeline. The fruits she arranged in careful piles were not just for sale, they were the difference between her children going to bed hungry and waking up with full bellies. She learned to barter, to haggle without fear, to force a smile even when exhaustion dragged at her bones. The other traders, mostly women like her, hardened by men who had taken their youth and left them with nothing but children and debts, became her companions. They gossiped between sales, their voices rising and falling like waves, sharing stories of husbands who had vanished, of sons who had become burdens, of daughters who carried too much sorrow in their eyes. Loy never spoke of Marco, never let his name linger on her tongue. He was as absent in her conversations as he was in her life. But in the quiet moments, when the crowd thinned and the sun sat heavy in the sky, she would catch herself staring at the road, wondering if he would appear, if his familiar swagger would weave through the stalls, if he would come to remind her that no matter how much she built on her own, she would always be the woman he left behind. It was the loneliness that weighed on her the most. Not just the absence of love, but the absence of a hand to share the burden, a voice to remind her that she was more than just a mother struggling to survive. Her daughters were too young to understand the depth of her exhaustion, too innocent to see the way her smile sometimes faltered. There were nights when she sat outside, staring at the moon, listening to the distant sound of music drifting from the houses that belonged to women who had what she did not, a husband, a home, the security of knowing that if they stumbled, there was someone to catch them. And it was in those nights, when the ache of solitude pressed the heaviest against her chest, that she made choices she never thought she would make. At first, it was small things. A man who offered to carry her basket in exchange for a moment of her attention. A stranger who bought more fruits than he needed just to make her smile. But the market was filled with eyes, and words traveled faster than the wind. Before long, the whispers began, quiet at first, then louder, painting her as a woman who had forgotten her place. She told herself she did it for her daughters, that the money she received from these men, these temporary shadows who came and went, was for school fees, for clothes, for food that Marco would never provide. But shame has a way of seeping into the skin, of settling in the bones like an illness that cannot be cured, and shame is only dangerous when it is exposed. The day Marco found out, the world came crashing down around her. He did not ask why, did not stop to consider the years of neglect that had led her to that moment. He did what men like him did best. He took his rage and turned it into a weapon. He dragged her into the street, his voice thick with disgust, calling her names that stung more than any slap ever could. The neighbors gathered, watching, whispering, nodding their heads as if they had always known she would come to this. And Loy, who had spent years enduring, who had swallowed her pain in silence, felt something inside her snap. She stood in that street, humiliated but unbroken, and she met Marco's eyes with a coldness that even he did not expect. If he thought he had the power to destroy her, he was wrong. Because that day, as she wiped the dust from her face and turned away from him for the last time, she realized something. She had survived worse, and she would survive this too. The days that followed Marco's public outburst were the hardest Loy had ever known. The whispers did not die down. They clung to her like the dust on the market road, settling into every corner of her life. When she walked through the stalls, she felt the weight of their stares, the sharp cut of their judgment. The women who once shared idle gossip with her now lowered their voices when she passed, their eyes darting away as if her shame might be contagious. Some turned their backs entirely, their loyalty shifting to their husbands, who spoke of her in crude terms, laughing over drinks about the woman who had been foolish enough to let herself be shamed. But Loy did not stop going to the market. She did not let the weight of their scorn break her. If anything, she worked harder, her hands moving faster, her voice firmer when she haggled for a fair price. She had spent too many years bending under the weight of other people's expectations, and she refused to bow any longer. At home, the tension settled thick between the walls. The children were too young to understand the full weight of what had happened, but they felt it. The eldest, barely old enough to carry responsibility, began to move differently, quieter, more careful, as if she could shield her mother from the world outside. The younger ones, including Akira, asked questions that Loy could not answer. Why are the neighbors looking at us like that? Why did Papa shout at you? When will he come back? Loy could not bring herself to tell them that he would not come back, that he had only ever come and gone as he pleased, and that this time he had left them with nothing but his anger. Instead, she worked harder. She took what little money she had and expanded her stall, adding more fruits, more variety, making sure that people had reason to come to her even if they did not want to. She knew that hunger would always be stronger than gossip, and she was right. Slowly, business picked up again. People came with cautious curiosity at first, then in steady waves, buying from her, speaking to her in careful tones, as if they could erase their cruelty with simple transactions. But Lloyd did not forget. She took their money, gave them their fruits, and moved on. As the years passed, the name Marco became nothing more than a shadow in her household. Her daughters grew into young women, each carrying the silent knowledge of what it meant to be raised by a mother who had been both abandoned and condemned. When the time came for the eldest to marry, Marco's name was spoken again, not as a man, but as a necessary formality. The elders who came to discuss the marriage insisted that a father's presence was needed, that no matter how absent he had been, his role in his daughter's life could not simply be erased. And so, with clenched teeth and a heart that burned with old wounds, Lloyd agreed. Marco appeared, older, smug, his presence an insult to the years she had spent raising their children alone. He took his place as if it had always belonged to him, nodded in approval, as if he had shaped the woman his daughter had become. And though the bitterness of it sat heavy in Lloyd's chest, she did not speak. She let her daughter have this, let her believe that some names, no matter how undeserved, still held weight in the eyes of tradition. But as Akira stood in the corner, watching, her face unreadable, Lloyd knew that at least one of her daughters would never forgive him. The first time Marco sat at the family table again, years after his disappearance, the house itself seemed to reject him. The wooden chairs, worn from years of Lloyd's careful hands, creaked under his weight, as if protesting his presence. The air inside the small dining room was thick with something unsaid, something bitter that clung to the walls. He did not belong there, and everyone knew it. But he sat anyway, his posture relaxed, his lips curved into the same smug smile he had always worn, like a man who had won, even when he had lost everything. The eldest daughter, the one who had pleaded for his presence, set his plate in front of him with careful hands, avoiding his gaze. She wanted to believe in a father's love, in a moment of redemption, but the weight of his absence could not be erased so easily. The younger ones, still caught between childhood and understanding, watched him with quiet curiosity, as if trying to fit this stranger into the stories they had been told. And then there was Akira. She did not sit with the others. She stood by the door, arms crossed, her expression unreadable, the only one who made no effort to pretend. Lloyd barely looked at him. She moved through the evening like a ghost, her presence more distant than it had ever been. She served the food in silence, her hands steady, her heart unreadable. She had spent too many years fighting battles that no one had seen, carrying burdens that no one had shared. Now, as Marco sat there, pretending to be something he had never been, she felt nothing. Not anger, not grief, just an exhaustion so deep that it settled into her bones. When he spoke, his voice was as smooth as ever, full of forced charm, as if he expected them to welcome him back with open arms. He told stories that none of them asked for, laughed at jokes only he found amusing, pretended that he was not a guest in the home he had abandoned. But the truth settled between them like a wound that had never healed. He was their father by name alone, a ghost of a man who had never been present in their lives. And as much as he tried to rewrite the past, the truth remained. He had never been there when they needed him. By the time the meal ended, the room felt colder, heavier. The eldest daughter forced a smile, trying to ease the tension, but it faltered when no one else followed. Marco leaned back in his chair, stretching, as if he had done something important simply by showing up. He looked at each of them in turn, his gaze lingering on Akira, whose silence was sharper than any words. She met his eyes without flinching, her expression unreadable, her presence unwavering. And then, without a word, she turned and left the room. The sound of her footsteps echoed through the small house, a quiet defiance that spoke louder than anything she could have said. Marco watched her go, a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze, but he did not call after her. He did not ask why, because deep down, even he knew there were some wounds that time could never heal, and Akira had never been the kind of child to forget. The night after Marco's visit, the house was heavier than it had ever been. It wasn't just the weight of his presence, but the way it lingered even after he had gone, the scent of old sweat and stale cologne, the echo of his laughter that no one had returned, the imprint of his hands on a chair that had never been his to sit in. Loy stayed up late, scrubbing the wooden table with more force than necessary, her fingers red from the effort. She told herself it was just cleaning, that it was just another night, but she knew the truth. His return had reopened something she had spent years trying to bury, and no matter how hard she scrubbed, some stains were not meant to be erased. Akira lay awake in the small room she shared with her younger sister, her body still, her mind restless. She had watched him, studied the way he carried himself, the way he acted as if nothing had happened. And yet, for all his arrogance, she had seen something else too, something weaker, something desperate. It was subtle, the way his fingers tapped against the table when no one was speaking, the way his smile tightened when no one laughed. He had come expecting something, and when he didn't get it, he had left without a word. In the days that followed, Marco did not return, but his shadow remained. The eldest daughter, the one who had fought for his presence, was quieter than usual, her disappointment a thing unspoken, but understood. The younger one still whispered about him, asking questions that no one had answers to. But Akira did not speak of him at all. She had nothing to say about a man who had only ever existed in name. Instead, she focused on the life she was building, waking up early to help her mother at the market, studying late into the night, pushing herself harder than anyone else. She refused to be defined by the man who had failed them. Yet, even as she tried to push forward, the past pulled at her like an anchor, dragging her back to memories she had tried to silence. She remembered being a child, small and helpless, lying awake in the dark, afraid of the footsteps that sometimes crept through the house. She remembered a hand on her mouth, the stifled cries, the silence that followed. She had never spoken of it, never told anyone, because who would have believed her? He was their father. He was supposed to love them. But love had never lived in the space between them, only fear, only power wielded in the dark where no one could see. The first time she dreamed of confronting him, she woke up shaking, her hands clenched into fists. The rage had lived inside her for years, buried beneath layers of silence, but now it was rising, demanding to be seen. She thought of the others, the sisters who had chosen to forgive, who had accepted him back with quiet resignation. Did they know? Had they ever felt the things she had felt? Or had she been the only one? The questions gnawed at her, but she did not ask them. Instead, she waited. She knew he would return. Men like him always did. They came back when they had nothing left, when the world had turned its back on them, when they had drained every last person who had once cared for them. And when that day came, when he stood before her again, expecting the same forgiveness he had been given before, she would not be silent. This time she would speak. The days stretched into weeks, and Marco's absence became a presence of its own. He had not returned, but his existence loomed over them like an unfinished sentence, a question waiting to be answered. The house had returned to its rhythm, Loy rising before the sun to prepare for the market, the younger girls helping where they could, laughter slipping through the walls in quiet moments. But beneath it all, something had shifted. Akira could feel it, the way her sisters hesitated before mentioning their father's name, the way their mother's hands stilled for a fraction of a second when a familiar memory resurfaced. It was as though they were all waiting for something inevitable, something none of them wanted to name. Akira buried herself in work, in responsibility, in proving to herself that she had risen beyond the man who had failed them. She stayed later at the shop, counted every coin, memorized every customer's face. If she could build something unshakable, something that belonged to her alone, then maybe, just maybe, She could silence the past that clawed at the edges of her mind. But silence had never been kind to her. It was in the silence that she had suffered, in the silence that she had learned the truth of what it meant to be powerless. And now, it was in the silence that the memories crept back, unwelcome and unrelenting. She remembered the first time it happened, how she had been too young to understand, how fear had wrapped around her throat like a fist. She remembered the way his breath had smelled stale, heavy with alcohol, the way his hands had pressed down, stealing the air from her lungs. And she remembered the morning after, when the world had continued as if nothing had changed, when her mother had hummed a tune while preparing breakfast, oblivious to the nightmare that had settled into her daughter's bones. Akira had spent years convincing herself that forgetting was the same as healing, that if she never spoke of it, then it would not have power over her. But she had been wrong. The past was not a thing that could be buried. It grew, it festered, it demanded to be reckoned with. And now, as she stared at the face in the mirror, older but still haunted, she knew that silence was no longer an option. Then, on an evening like any other, the past returned in the flesh. Marco was back, standing in their doorway, thinner than before, weaker, his shoulders hunched under the weight of a man who had lost everything. His lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Akira stood at the far end of the room, watching him, waiting. The others hesitated, their eyes darting between him and their mother, unsure of what to do. But Akira did not move, did not speak. The moment stretched, heavy with everything that had never been said, with every wound that had never healed. And then, finally, Marco lifted his gaze and met hers. Something flickered there, recognition, perhaps, or something closer to fear. And in that moment she knew. He remembered. He knew what he had done. And yet, he had still come, still expected something from her.
Akira Ezeleslau stood in her so.
The moment she had been waiting for had finally arrived. But this time, she would not run. This time, she would not stay silent. The room was suffocatingly quiet, the kind of silence that swallows the air and presses against the skin. Marco stood there, his figure diminished by time, by regret, by the weight of a past that had finally caught up with him. His once proud shoulders slumped, his frame frail beneath clothes that no longer fit, his hands trembling where they hung at his sides. It was strange, Akira thought, how small he looked now. As a child, he had been larger than life, a force of terror wrapped in the skin of a man. Now, he was barely a shadow of that monster, yet the sight of him sent ice through her veins. Loy stood by the kitchen, her expression unreadable, but her hands gripped the edge of the counter, as if she needed something to hold her upright. The other girls exchanged hesitant glances, their eyes flitting between Marco and Akira, as if waiting for someone to speak first. But Akira did not rush. She let the silence stretch, let him feel the weight of it, let him know that his presence was not welcome here.
Marco cleared his throat, the sound dry and weak. Akira, her name in his mouth felt like an intrusion, like dirt staining something clean. She did not move, did not flinch. He shifted, glancing at the others as if hoping for support, but none came. Even the sisters who had forgiven him before now watched with caution, their previous acceptance warring with the unease of his sudden return.
"I know I don't deserve anything from you," he continued, his voice breaking under the weight of his own words. "I know I was not a good father." Akira let out a short, humorless laugh, her arms folding across her chest. Not a good father. The understatement made her stomach churn. A man who abandoned his children was not a good father.
A man who humiliated their mother for surviving the neglect he forced upon her was not a good father, and a man who stole the innocence of his own child was not a father at all. But she said none of this. Instead, she tilted her head, watching him as one might watch a dying animal, detached, unmoved. "What do you want?" she asked finally, her voice sharper than she intended. He swallowed, eyes flickering with something close to shame. "I'm sick," he admitted, and for the first time his voice wavered. "I have nowhere else to go." The words hung in the air, and something in the room shifted. Loy's grip on the counter tightened. One of the younger sisters lowered her gaze, and a quiet exhale passed through the eldest. He was here because he had no other choice, because the world had turned its back on him just as he had once turned his back on them. Akira stared at him, at the fragile thing he had become, and for a fleeting moment she felt something unexpected, pity. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by something colder, something final. "You should have thought about that before," she said, her voice calm, steady. She took a step closer, closing the distance between them until she could see the cracks in his skin, the hollow of his cheeks, the fear behind his eyes. "There are fates worse than death, Marco. You get to die. I get to live with what you did." The words were barely above a whisper, but they cut through the room like a blade. And then, without another glance, she turned and walked away, leaving him to stand in the ruins of the life he had destroyed. Night settled over the house like a heavy blanket, but rest did not come easily. The air remained thick with everything that had been said and everything that hadn't. Marco had not left. He sat outside beneath the weak glow of the moon, his presence a ghostly reminder of all the years he had abandoned them. Through the small window, Akira could see him, his frail body curled into itself, a man who once commanded rooms, now reduced to an unwelcome stranger on the fringes of a home that was never truly his. Inside, her sisters moved with hesitance, unsure of how to process his sudden return. Loy, ever the woman of unspoken battles, sat in the dimly lit parlor, her fingers pressed against her temple, her face unreadable. The house was restless, filled with shifting bodies and unfinished thoughts, but Akira remained still. She had said her piece, and yet the weight in her chest did not lift. She had spent years preparing for the moment she would confront him, but she had never considered what came after. The next morning, the tension did not ease. The scent of fried plantains and pepper soup filled the air, but no one ate with their usual appetite. The youngest of the sisters, who had always been the softest among them, carried a bowl outside hesitantly, her steps slow and uncertain. Akira watched from the doorway, her arms crossed as her sister placed the food beside Marco, without a word, before retreating just as quickly. He did not touch it immediately, only glanced at it with something between gratitude and shame. Akira felt nothing watching him, or at least she told herself that. The past did not deserve pity. And yet, even as she hardened herself against him, a part of her recognized the cruelty of fate, that the man who had once wielded power over them all was now powerless in the one place he sought refuge. But she would not be swayed, not when the echoes of what he had done still lived within her, not when every breath she took reminded her of the nightmares that had shaped her childhood. She turned away, refusing to let the moment linger, but the image of him, small, broken, followed her like a shadow. As the day wore on, voices softened, but the tension remained unbroken. Loy had not told Marco to leave, but she had not welcomed him either. Perhaps, after everything, she wanted to see him suffer just a little longer. That evening, as the wind carried the distant hum of life beyond their compound, Akira stood at the edge of the veranda, her eyes fixed on the horizon. She did not flinch when she heard him shuffle behind her, his steps hesitant, weak. "I don't expect forgiveness," he rasped, and she remained silent. He exhaled shakily before continuing, "But I need you to know. I regret everything." Akira let his words hang in the air, unmoved. Regret. It was such a useless thing. It did not undo the years of silence, did not erase the scars he had left behind. Slowly, she turned her head just enough to look at him, and in her eyes there was no softness, no kindness. "You regret it because you have nothing left," she said, her voice cold. "If life had been kind to you, you wouldn't be here. You wouldn't even be thinking of me." Marco's face fell, the truth cutting deeper than he had expected.
She held his gaze for a moment longer before turning away once more, letting the night swallow whatever else he might have had to say. The following days stretched long and uneasy, each one bringing a quiet storm that no one dared to name. Marco remained, though no one asked him to stay. He did not demand, did not beg. He simply existed in the space between them, a ghost walking through the remnants of a life he had abandoned. The sisters moved around him like he was furniture, a thing to be stepped over, to be acknowledged only when necessary. Loy, ever the silent observer, watched him from a distance, her expression neither soft nor cruel, as if she were waiting for something, though she would never say what. Akira, however, was not waiting. She was counting the moments, hoping each one would be the last. Every glimpse of him unsettled something deep within her, a rage that had been buried so long it had hardened into something sharper than anger, something that had no name. She could not fathom how the others had found it within themselves to let him linger. Every breath he took in this house was a mockery of all he had stolen. One evening, a heavy rainstorm swept through the town, rattling the roof, sending sharp gusts of wind through the open windows. The power flickered, then vanished altogether, plunging the house into thick darkness. A single lantern burned in the sitting room, its flame casting uneven shadows against the walls. Akira sat by the window, listening to the rain drum against the earth, when she heard footsteps shuffle behind her. She did not turn. She knew who it was. The weak cough, the hesitant step, she had learned to recognize his presence without looking. "I should leave," Marco murmured, his voice barely above the rain's whisper. For the first time, something in his tone was different. It lacked the desperate edge, the expectation of mercy. It was the voice of a man who had finally understood that some things were beyond repair. Akira remained still, her fingers tracing the condensation on the window pane. "Then go," she said evenly, not out of cruelty, but because she meant it. She heard him shift, heard the weight of his breath as he hesitated. "But before I do," he continued, "there's something I need to say." Akira stiffened, her pulse tightening. There was nothing he could say that would change anything. Yet still, she did not move, did not stop him. The storm howled outside, the wind pressing against the house as if trying to force its way in. Marco exhaled slowly before speaking. "I was a coward," he admitted, his voice rough with age and regret. "Not just to you, not just to your mother, but to myself. I thought if I ignored it, if I never spoke of it, it would disappear. But it didn't. It grew, and it swallowed everything." He paused, swallowing hard. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't deserve it. I just needed to say it out loud." For once, the words settled between them, heavier than the rain, thicker than the air. Akira closed her eyes, feeling the storm both outside and within. She had spent her whole life waiting for an apology, but now that it had come, it felt hollow, too late. She opened her eyes and turned just enough to meet his gaze, tired, weary, filled with something close to understanding. And then, without a word, she stood, walked past him, and disappeared into the dark. The morning after the storm was eerily quiet. The sky, still weighed down by the night's rain, stretched in dull shades of gray, casting the house in a muted glow. The air smelled of damp earth and old memories, of things washed clean, but never quite forgotten. Akira woke early, though she had barely slept. Her mind had been restless, circling around words spoken in the dark, around confessions that came far too late. She stepped outside, the wooden planks of the veranda creaking beneath her bare feet. The world felt strangely still. Marco was gone. His absence was not dramatic. There was no final plea, no lingering shadow where he had once sat. Just an empty space, as if he had never been there at all. The bowl of untouched food, swollen with rainwater, sat where her youngest sister had placed it days before. Akira stared at it for a long time, something unreadable settling in her chest. She had thought she would feel relief when he left, that the weight pressing against her ribs would lift, but instead, there was only quiet. Inside the house, the others moved with slow caution, as if afraid to acknowledge the shift. Lois sat in her usual chair, her hands resting in her lap, her eyes distant. She had known Marco longer than any of them, had suffered under his choices more than anyone else, yet she did not ask where he had gone. Perhaps she already knew. Akira lingered near the doorway, watching her mother's stillness, searching for any sign of what she felt. But Lloyd did not speak of him. She simply turned her gaze toward her daughter, and nodded, as if acknowledging something that did not need words. The day unfolded in measured silence. Life resumed in the only way it knew how, through small, necessary motions. The market opened, voices called out in the streets. The world did not pause. And yet, Akira carried something different within her, something unspoken. She had spent years believing that confronting Marco would bring closure, that making him face what he had done would somehow erase its hold on her. But the truth was far less satisfying. There was no undoing the past, no magic in revenge. He had left, but the wounds he created remained. As evening fell, Akira found herself walking beyond the house, past the road that led to the market, past the places that felt familiar. She did not know where she was going, only that she needed to move. The sky darkened, the air thick with the scent of wet soil, and still she walked. At some point she stopped, staring out at the open land before her, at the stretch of road that disappeared into the distance. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to breathe without holding back, to exist without the weight of waiting. Marco had been right about one thing. He had been a coward. But she refused to be. She would not live trapped in the echoes of what he had done. He had taken enough from her. No more. With one last glance at the road behind her, Akira turned back toward home, her steps slow, steady, certain. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.